Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The economic picture in the U.S., well, it's looking a little shaky, wouldn't you say? A lot of that seems tied to the president's tariff policies.
Definitely. And even with that 90-day pause for most countries, though, importantly not China, the markets haven't exactly roared back.
Right. And while everyone's watching those numbers, something else seems to be kind of brewing just south of the border, something that might actually have even bigger ripple effects.
You're talking about the potential confrontation with the Mexican drug cartels.
Exactly. We're seeing reports mostly from U.S. media outlets, um, general outlets not seen as supportive of the president, that the CIA is actually exploring the legal side of using lethal force.
Lethal force, like drone strikes.
Yes, including drone strikes, potentially inside Mexico,
Hmm.
maybe even Venezuela. I mean, just think about that for a second.
That would be a dramatic escalation, a huge shift in how the U.S. has approached the drug war.
For sure. And it raises some really serious questions, about the risk of actual conflict with Mexico.
It's fascinating how these things connect, isn't it? Economic wobbles at home, and then this kind of potential military action abroad, or rather next door.
Right. Now, we need to be clear. These are apparently discussions at this point. Nothing's final.
Okay, so discussions involving who?
The White House, DOD, CIA, other intel agencies, they're reportedly looking at options, ways to hit the cartels harder, especially those trafficking fentanyl across the border.
And the reports suggest they might act even without Mexico's okay.
Yeah, the idea of unilateral action hasn't been ruled out, apparently, though there's also some mention, maybe less likely, of possible joint U.S.-Mexico drone strikes.
Joint strikes seem politically very difficult for Mexico.
Yeah.
You have President Scheinbaum with sky-high approval ratings.
Over 80%, yeah. And letting the U.S. military operate, especially conduct lethal strikes on Mexican soil, that would likely cause a massive backlash.
Huge. You remember what the Mexican journalist Eduardo Ruiz Healy said? Something like, no country invites another to invade it.
Exactly. Her popularity could plummet. And her own party, Morena, they'd probably be furious, given their focus on, national sovereignty.
And that taps into something deep, right? Mexican patriotism is strong, and there's a real historical resistance to foreign interference, especially from the U.S.
Absolutely. You look back over the last 2 centuries, there have been multiple U.S. invasions, interventions, that history casts a long shadow.
It absolutely does. Essential context for understanding the potential reaction.
And, this specific idea, U.S. drones in Mexico, it's not entirely brand new either. Apparently, President Trump floated it back in 2020, according to Mark Esper, his defense secretary then.
Right, I recall that report.
And then just last year, 2023, you had figures like Senators Rubio and Graham and former AG Barr pushing to label the cartels as terrorist organizations.
Which would open the door legally, or at least provide justification for military force.
Precisely. And now, Trump's current team, people like Secretary of State Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, they've also used language like all options are on the table.
So a consistent theme emerging there.
Okay, so that brings us to the heart of our deep dive today. What are the real significant risks? What could the negative fallout be if the U.S. actually did launch drone strikes in Mexico, especially with the economy already feeling, well, fragile?
It's a critical question. Because while hitting the cartels directly might sound decisive to some, the potential downsides are substantial and touch on so many areas.
Okay, so let's start with maybe the most obvious one, point one. Mexico's right next door.
Yeah, that geographical proximity changes everything. It's not Iraq, it's not Syria, not Yemen, places the U.S. has conducted bombing campaigns before.
Totally different scenario. We share, what, almost a 2,000-mile border? The busiest land border in the world.
Exactly, 1,954 miles. So this isn't some distant battlefield, it's our neighbor.
And that immediately raises the stakes for U.S. citizens, right?
Yeah.
People living there, traveling there.
Absolutely. Reports even mention the CIA is worried about the legal side if Americans get accidentally killed in these strikes.
And beyond U.S. citizens, the potential harm to ordinary Mexicans is huge. We've seen the history with drone strikes elsewhere.
We have civilian casualties. It's been a recurring tragedy in places like Afghanistan and Yemen. Collateral damage is a very real risk.
Remember that New York Times investigation from 2021 found U.S. airstrikes often hit the wrong targets, caused immense civilian harm. Precision isn't always, well, precise.
And it's interesting, President Trump is often painted as anti-war, at least in the sense of not starting new wars during his first term.
Yeah, that's a common talking point from his supporters.
But if you look specifically at drone strikes, the numbers tell a slightly different story. His administration between 2017 and 2019 actually carried out more strikes than Obama did over 8 years.
Wow. What were the numbers?
The Bureau of Investigative Journalism reported 2,243 strikes under Trump in those first 3 years, compared to 1,878 under Obama over 8.
This is pretty stark. And then didn't he also stop the requirement to report civilian deaths from strikes outside active war zones?
He did, back in 2019. That, plus recent actions in Yemen, it suggests a definite willingness to use this tool.
But using it in Mexico,
hmm
as you said, it brings the consequences right to our doorstep. It could destabilize a key neighbor, a key ally.
Which leads directly into the second major risk, doesn't it? Ruining the relationship with Mexico.
Yeah. Talk about a complicated history.
Deeply complicated. As you mentioned earlier, there's a long history of U.S. interventions since Mexico's independence in 1821, at least 10 significant ones.
And some loom larger than others.
Yeah,
Mexican-American War.
1846 to 48. That still felt very strongly in Mexico. The U.S. took, 55% of their territory. California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, New Mexico.
A massive loss. And then there was the occupation of Veracruz in 1914.
Right. So given all that history, another U.S. attack, especially unilateral, it would almost certainly spark outrage, massive resentment.
But it could just torpedo the cooperation we do have right now, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Mexico actually is working with the U.S. on some of this. They recently extradited, I think, 29 alleged cartel figures, and they're considering more.
That kind of cooperation is vital, isn't it? For fighting the cartels, for border security.
Totally vital. If the U.S. goes ahead with unilateral strikes, you could see that cooperation just evaporate. Mexico might even cut diplomatic ties.
Which would make it harder to deal with drug trafficking and illegal immigration, two of Trump's biggest stated priorities.
Exactly. The irony is palpable.
And let's not forget the economic ties. That cross-border trade is enormous.
Huge. Around $776 billion annually. Messing up the relationship this badly would inevitably hurt that trade, damage both economies, definitely the U.S. economy too.
Okay, so point 3. More war, potentially leading to more immigration.
It's a very likely consequence. History shows us wars create refugees, create displacement.
We saw it with the war on terror, didn't we? The Costs of War project estimated at least 38 million people displaced.
Precisely. And think about Europe after the destabilization in the Middle East and North Africa post 9/11. Major migration waves.
So if you create conflict and chaos in our own backyard, so to speak.
And it stands to reason you'd see a similar flow of people trying to escape. Mexico has, 130 million people? And if this involves other countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Peru,
The numbers trying to reach the U.S. could be staggering.
potentially overwhelming border security, it could create the very nightmare scenario the administration says wants to prevent.
Kind of counterintuitive.
And worse, cartels thrive on chaos. They already exploit instability to smuggle drugs and people. A U.S. military campaign could actually give them more opportunities.
Wow. Okay, fourth major risk.
Yeah.
Getting sucked into another endless war.
Yeah, we need to see this in context. The war on drugs itself is already, 54 years old, started by Nixon in 71. It became this global thing with, let's be honest, pretty mixed results and lots of negative side effects.
And the war on terror is still going after 24 years.
Right. So if you start labeling cartels narco-terrorists and bombing them, are you just setting the stage for another forever war?
And does bombing the leaders, the so-called kingpin strategy, even work?
Well, the evidence suggests not really, no. Often, when you kill a leader with a drone strike, it just leads to internal power struggles, more violence.
And the cartel splinter, maybe?
That's
Making it harder to track?
Exactly. They fragment into smaller groups. Plus, these Mexican cartels, they're not just gangs, they're more like paramilitary
The
forces.
global networks, billions in cash.
Operations inside the U.S. already. They're not going to be easily wiped out by a few drone strikes.
Which raises another scary thought. Retaliation.
It's a real possibility. If the U.S. starts military attacks in Mexico, could the cartels hit back? Maybe with terrorist-style attacks on U.S. soil, where they definitely have a presence.
That's a chilling prospect.
Yeah.
Okay, fifth and final point we wanted to cover. The economic collapse, the trade fallout.
Right. We touched on the economy earlier, with the tariffs already causing strain. Bombing Mexico could make things much, much worse by threatening the USMCA.
The big trade deal. U.S., Mexico, Canada.
Yeah.
Like a $1.5 trillion block, right?
Yeah.
Trump negotiated it in 2020.
Yep. But relations were already a bit frayed because of his tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Canada even hit back with retaliatory tariffs.
So an actual U.S. attack on Mexico?
Yeah.
that could just shatter the whole agreement.
It really could. The USMCA could collapse entirely.
And the numbers involved.
Yeah.
We said $776 billion in trade with Mexico last year. Canada's around $700 billion.
Losing those markets, or even seriously damaging that trade, it would hammer American businesses, workers, consumers, just devastating.
And this is happening while the trade war with China, our third biggest partner, is escalating again.
Exactly. The combined effect.
Yeah.
Hitting our top two partners while fighting with number three, it could absolutely trigger a deep recession, just as we're trying to recover from the last tariff issues.
So, given all these potential, frankly, disastrous outcomes,
Yeah.
why? Why would the administration even be considering this now? What's the thinking?
Well, speculation varies. Some think it might be a distraction, from the tariff mess, the shaky markets, change the subject.
Okay. What else?
Others suggest it's about projecting U.S. power in Latin America, maybe trying to push back against China's growing influence down there.
Right, the geopolitical angle.
And there's even been some speculation, maybe more politically pointed, that the real target isn't just the cartels, but maybe Mexico's ruling party, Morena, because they don't always align with U.S. economic ideas.
Whatever the reason, it feels like the potential blowback is being, seriously underestimated or ignored.
It seems that way. Especially when you consider, as we mentioned, Mexico is actually doing things. They are cracking down. They are extraditing leaders.
And maybe the U.S. isn't looking hard enough at its own role, like cartel money being laundered through U.S. banks, the flow of American guns to Mexico.
Absolutely critical points. Instead of just focusing on military options over the border, maybe the focus should be more on, things the U.S. can control at home, including the massive U.S. demand for drugs that fuels the whole business.
So wrapping this up, it really sounds like bombing Mexico would be an incredibly reckless, high-stakes gamble.
Extremely. The potential downsides we've discussed: a new war, economic chaos, a worse border crisis, and maybe not even stopping the cartels. They're just huge.
And the U.S. and Mexico are so intertwined, aren't they? Like 37 million Mexican Americans in the U.S., the cartels operating on both sides. The blowback wouldn't be distant. It would be felt right here.
Directly. Substantially.
It feels like moving from a, let's call it, tariff tantrum to a potential military disaster is not the most thought-out strategy.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for our listeners to mull over. Given this incredibly complex web, the economic ties, the migration, the history, the sensitivities, what alternative strategies could the U.S. explore? Strategies that actually prioritize long-term stability and security for the whole region, instead of reaching for potentially destabilizing military force.